Supreme Court just delivered a bombshell ruling that sent shockwaves through Westminster and exposed what many are calling Keir Starmer's secret betrayal of Brexit. Just 1 minute ago, Britain's highest legal authority made a decision that has completely derailed the Prime Minister's hidden plans to drag the UK back into the EU's clutches through the back door. The ruling has sparked absolute chaos across the nation, with millions of Brits demanding answers about what Starmer has been plotting behind closed doors. This isn't just another political scandal. This is about the very sovereignty and independence that 17.4 million people voted for back in 2016. The establishment thought they could quietly reverse Brexit without anyone noticing, but the Supreme Court just pulled back the curtain on the entire operation. And what they've revealed is absolutely stunning. Right now, protests are erupting in cities across Britain as citizens realise just how close they came to having their democratic vote completely overturned. The question everyone's asking is simple. How long has Starmer been planning this, and who else in Westminster knew about it? Stick around, because what we're about to reveal will show you exactly how deep this conspiracy goes and why this Supreme Court decision might have just saved Britain from losing its independence forever. The Supreme Court's emergency session this morning has left political analysts absolutely speechless. According to sources inside the courtroom, the justices handed down a unanimous decision that completely dismantles the legal framework Starmer's government had been quietly constructing over the past 18 months. The ruling specifically targets a series of regulatory alignments and treaty modifications that Labour had been negotiating with Brussels in complete secrecy. These weren't just minor administrative adjustments. These were fundamental changes that would have bound Britain to EU law in everything from trade standards to immigration policy, effectively making Brexit meaningless without anyone voting for it. The Supreme Court's Chief Justice didn't mince words, stating that the government's actions represented a constitutional overreach of unprecedented proportions and a direct violation of parliamentary sovereignty. What makes this even more explosive is that the court revealed documents showing that senior Labour ministers had been holding secret meetings with EU commissioners in Brussels, Luxembourg and Strasbourg, deliberately keeping these negotiations hidden from Parliament and the British public. The level of deception is staggering. We're talking about binding agreements on regulatory standards, environmental policies, and even aspects of foreign policy that would have essentially returned the UK to EU control without the benefits of membership. Think about that for a moment. Starmer's government was preparing to surrender British sovereignty while telling everyone they were simply engaging in normal diplomatic relations. The Supreme Court's investigation uncovered email chains, confidential memos and recorded conversations that paint a picture of systematic deception at the highest levels of government. The timeline is particularly damning. Evidence presented to the court shows that planning for this EU realignment began almost immediately after Labour took office. Within weeks of entering number 10, Starmer reportedly established a secret working group tasked with finding legal pathways to reverse Brexit without calling it that. They knew they couldn't simply rejoin the EU. The political backlash would be catastrophic. Instead, they developed what insiders are calling the salami slice strategy, gradually aligning Britain with EU regulations piece by piece until the country was effectively back in the bloc without anyone realising it had happened. The Supreme Court discovered that this working group operated outside normal government channels, with participants using encrypted communications and meeting in locations deliberately chosen to avoid media attention. Several high-ranking civil servants have now come forward as whistleblowers, providing testimony about how they were pressured to draft legislation that would seamlessly integrate EU law into British statute without explicit parliamentary approval. One former advisor described an atmosphere of paranoia within the group, with members constantly worried about leaks and obsessed with maintaining absolute secrecy. The court heard how draft treaties were prepared with intentionally vague language designed to obscure their true implications, how impact assessments were manipulated to downplay the sovereignty implications, and how legal opinions warning about constitutional violations were suppressed or ignored. Perhaps most shocking of all, The Supreme Court revealed that Starmer's team had already agreed in principle to accept jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice in specific policy areas, a red line that even many Remain voters agreed should never be crossed after Brexit. The political fallout has been immediate and devastating for the Labour government. Within hours of the ruling, dozens of Labour MPs began distancing themselves from the Prime Minister, with several backbenchers openly calling for his resignation. The opposition parties have naturally seized on this revelation, with Conservative MPs describing it as the greatest betrayal of democratic will in modern British history. Reform UK leader Nigel Farage held an emergency press conference declaring that this proves everything he'd been warning about for years, that the establishment never accepted Brexit and would do anything to reverse it. Social media has exploded with outrage, with hashtags like treasonous Starmer and save our sovereignty trending across every platform. But it's not just politicians and activists who are furious. Ordinary Brits from all walks of life are expressing shock and anger at how close the country came to having its democratic decision overturned. In working class communities that voted overwhelmingly for Brexit, the sense of betrayal is palpable. These are people who were promised that Brexit meant Brexit, that their vote would be respected, and that Britain would forge its own independent path. Now, they're learning that behind the scenes, the government they elected was systematically working to undo everything they voted for. The Supreme Court's ruling has vindicated their suspicions and confirmed their worst fears about Westminster's contempt for ordinary voters. Market reactions have been severe as well, with the pound fluctuating wildly as investors try to process the political chaos. International observers are watching closely, with some calling it a constitutional crisis that strikes at the heart of British democracy. What makes this situation even more complex is the European Union's response, or rather their suspicious silence. Brussels has yet to issue any official statement about the Supreme Court's revelations, which many interpret as confirmation that they were indeed deeply involved in these secret negotiations. EU officials must have known they were dealing with a British government operating beyond its constitutional mandate, yet they continued the discussions anyway. This raises serious questions about the EU's respect for democratic processes and national sovereignty. Some European politicians have privately expressed concern that this scandal could actually strengthen anti-EU sentiment, not just in Britain, but across the entire continent. If Brussels is seen as actively conspiring with national governments to undermine democratic referendums, it feeds into the narrative that the EU is an undemocratic superstate that doesn't respect the will of national populations. Already, Eurosceptic parties in France, Italy, the Netherlands and other member states are pointing to the Starmer scandal with their evidence of why their countries should be wary of EU power. The timing couldn't be worse for Brussels, which is already dealing with internal divisions over everything from migration policy to economic coordination. The last thing EU leaders wanted was a massive scandal that makes them look like puppet masters trying to control national governments. But that's exactly what this looks like, and the damage to the EU's reputation could be significant and long-lasting. The legal implications of the Supreme Court's ruling extend far beyond this immediate political crisis and could reshape the constitutional landscape of Britain for generations to come. Legal experts are describing the decision as a landmark moment that fundamentally redefines the limits of executive power and reinforces parliamentary sovereignty in ways that haven't been seen since the constitutional battles of the 17th century. The court didn't just strike down Starmer's specific actions, they established new precedents that will make it virtually impossible for any future government to attempt similar backdoor manoeuvres without facing immediate legal consequences. The ruling essentially creates a constitutional firewall protecting the Brexit referendum result and, by extension, any major democratic decision from being quietly undermined by government officials operating in the shadows. Constitutional lawyers are poring over the 170-page judgment, noting how the justices meticulously documented every instance where the government exceeded its authority, violated established protocols, or deliberately misled Parliament about the nature and scope of its EU negotiations. What's particularly significant is the court's strong language about democratic accountability and the sacred trust between government and governed. The Chief Justice wrote that when citizens make a clear decision in a referendum of historic importance, that decision cannot be reversed through administrative sleight of hand or bureaucratic manoeuvring. It requires explicit democratic consent through another referendum or a clear electoral mandate. This principle now has the force of supreme legal authority behind it, making it a cornerstone of British constitutional law going forward. The judgment also addresses the question of ministerial responsibility, making it clear that ministers who knowingly engage in activities that undermine major democratic decisions can face not just political consequences, but potential legal sanctions as well. Several legal scholars are suggesting that this opens the door for criminal investigations into whether Starmer and his inner circle committed misconduct in public office, a serious charge that carries significant penalties, including potential imprisonment. The political ramifications are spreading like wildfire through Westminster as MPs from all parties begin to grasp the full implications of what the Supreme Court has uncovered. Labour's internal divisions, which had been simmering beneath the surface for months, have now exploded into open warfare. The party's pro-Brexit faction, already marginalised and ignored by the leadership, is demanding a complete leadership election and a fundamental reassessment of Labour's European policy. These MPs represent constituencies that voted heavily for Brexit, and they're facing furious constituents who feel utterly betrayed by a Labour government they trusted. Meanwhile, the party's metropolitan wing, which never really accepted Brexit in the first place, finds itself in an impossible position, unable to defend Starmer's deception, but also uncomfortable with the idea of embracing Brexit more fully. This internal conflict is tearing Labour apart at the seams, with local party organisations passing votes of no confidence in the national leadership and constituency parties, demanding answers about who knew what and when. The trade unions, traditionally Labour's most powerful allies, are deeply split as well. Union leaders in manufacturing and construction, whose members largely supported Brexit, are calling for Starmer's resignation and threatening to withdraw funding from the party. Meanwhile, public sector unions whose members tended to support Remain are trying to navigate a middle path that satisfies no one. The Conservative Party, despite its own recent struggles and internal divisions, suddenly finds itself with a massive political opening. Shadow ministers are calling for an immediate general election, arguing that Labour has lost any mandate to govern after being caught trying to reverse Brexit through deception. They're demanding a full public inquiry into the secret EU negotiations, with powers to compel testimony under oath and access to all government communications related to the matter. The Liberal Democrats, who have always been openly pro-European, are in an awkward position as well, trying to condemn the secrecy and deception, while not alienating their pro-EU voter base. Public reaction continues to intensify as more details emerge about the scope and scale of Starmer's secret EU alignment programme. Town halls and community centres across Britain are hosting emergency meetings where angry citizens are demanding answers from their local MPs regardless of party affiliation. In dozens of constituencies, recall petitions are being organised in an attempt to force by-elections and remove MPs who supported or enabled the government's actions. The sense of betrayal runs particularly deep in traditional Labour heartlands in the north of England, the Midlands and Wales, regions that broke with decades of Labour loyalty to vote for Brexit in 2016 and then returned to Labour in the last election on the promise that the party had accepted Brexit. These communities feel doubly betrayed, first by Conservative governments that they felt mishandled Brexit, and now by a Labour government that was apparently trying to undo it entirely. Local Labour councillors are reporting unprecedented levels of anger and hostility from constituents who feel their democratic voice has been completely disregarded by a political class that views them with contempt. This grassroots fury is manifesting in ways that go beyond traditional political protest. Community groups are organising campaigns to hold local politicians accountable, scrutinising every vote and every statement to determine who knew about the secret negotiations and who can credibly claim ignorance. Social media has become a tool for coordinating these local accountability efforts, with citizens sharing information about their MPs' voting records, their statements about Brexit, and any connections they might have to the pro-EU lobby. The mainstream media, which many Brexit supporters have long viewed with suspicion, is now facing intense pressure to provide comprehensive coverage of the scandal rather than downplaying it or spinning it in ways that protect the establishment. The international dimension of this crisis continues to develop in unexpected ways, and as foreign governments try to understand what this means for Britain's place in the world and its reliability as a negotiating partner. The United States, which has been pursuing closer trade and security ties with post-Brexit Britain, is reportedly concerned about the political instability and questioning whether any agreements reached with the current government will survive the ongoing crisis. American officials have privately expressed frustration that they weren't informed about the secret EU negotiations, which could have affected transatlantic trade discussions and security cooperation frameworks. Other Commonwealth nations, particularly Australia, Canada and New Zealand, which have been negotiating their own trade deals with Britain, based on the assumption that the UK was genuinely pursuing an independent trade policy, are reassessing their positions and wondering if they've been wasting time and resources on agreements that might never be properly implemented. Asian trading partners, including Japan, South Korea and Singapore, are watching closely as well, concerned that British political instability could disrupt carefully balanced supply chains and investment plans. Perhaps most significantly, this scandal is being closely monitored by other countries within the European Union that have their own Eurosceptic movements. Political parties and activists in nations like Poland, Hungary, Italy and France are using the Starmer scandal as evidence of why national sovereignty must be fiercely protected against EU overreach. They're arguing that if Brussels was willing to conspire with the British government to undermine a democratic referendum, what might they be planning in other member states? The economic consequences of this constitutional crisis are beginning to ripple through every sector of British society as businesses, investors and financial institutions try to navigate the uncertainty created by the Supreme Court's devastating ruling. The London Stock Exchange experienced significant volatility immediately following the announcement, with major indices swinging wildly as traders struggled to price in the political risk now facing the country. Currency markets saw the pound sterling drop sharply against both the dollar and the euro before recovering somewhat as analysts debated whether this crisis would ultimately strengthen or weaken Britain's economic position. Some economists argue that the exposure of Starmer's secret EU plot actually provides clarity and removes uncertainty about Britain's future direction, suggesting that markets prefer a clear, independent path over ambiguous semi-alignment with Brussels. Others contend that the political chaos itself creates investment risks regardless of the underlying policy direction, pointing to the possibility of early elections, government collapse or extended political paralysis that could delay crucial economic decisions. Business leaders across various industries are expressing deep concern about what this means for their planning and operations. Companies that had been banking on gradual EU regulatory alignment are now scrambling to adjust their strategies, while those that invested heavily in preparing for a truly independent British regulatory environment feel vindicated but worried about continued political instability. The City of London, Britain's financial powerhouse, finds itself caught in the middle of this storm. Major banks and financial institutions had developed complex contingency plans for various Brexit scenarios, but few anticipated a situation where a sitting government would be caught secretly trying to reverse Brexit only to be stopped by the Supreme Court. International investors are demanding answers about Britain's regulatory future, the stability of its political institutions, and whether the rule of law is strong enough to protect their investments from political manipulation. Manufacturing sectors that depend on complex supply chains spanning multiple countries are particularly vulnerable to the ongoing uncertainty. Automotive manufacturers, aerospace companies and pharmaceutical producers all require regulatory clarity to make long-term investment decisions about where to locate production facilities and how to structure their operations. The revelation that the British government was secretly negotiating regulatory alignment with the EU while publicly maintaining that Britain would chart its own course has shattered trust in government communications and made it nearly impossible for these companies to confidently plan for the future. Several major manufacturers have already announced that they're postponing investment decisions worth billions of pounds until the political situation stabilises and they can get honest answers about Britain's regulatory direction. This investment freeze threatens thousands of jobs and could have cascading effects throughout regional economies that depend on these anchor industries. Small and medium-sized businesses, which employ the vast majority of British workers, are equally confused and concerned. Many of these enterprises lack the resources to maintain separate compliance systems for different regulatory regimes, so they desperately need to know whether they should be aligning with EU standards, developing uniquely British approaches, or somehow trying to satisfy both systems simultaneously. The mixed messages from government over the past months, now revealed to be part of a deliberate deception strategy, have left these businesses feeling abandoned and betrayed by politicians who seem more interested in constitutional manoeuvring than in providing the stable environment businesses need to thrive. Trade organisations representing small businesses are reporting that their members feel caught in the crossfire of a political battle that treats their livelihoods as collateral damage. The implications for Britain's trade policy are equally profound and troubling. Over the past several years since Brexit, the UK has been negotiating trade agreements with countries around the world, presenting itself as an independent trading nation freed from EU constraints and able to craft bespoke deals that serve British interests. The revelation that the government was simultaneously and secretly working to realign with EU regulations completely undermines the credibility of these negotiations. Trading partners who invested time, political capital and resources into negotiating with Britain are rightfully questioning whether the agreements they reached were made in good faith or whether they were simply being used as cover while the real plan was always to drift back toward Brussels. This credibility crisis could haunt British trade negotiations for years to come, with potential partners demanding additional safeguards, escape clauses or verification mechanisms to protect themselves against future reversals of a British policy. The damage to Britain's reputation as a reliable negotiating partner is immeasurable and will take considerable time and effort to repair. Countries that were considering prioritising trade talks with the UK are now reassessing whether Britain is stable enough to be worth the investment of diplomatic resources. Some are choosing to wait until the political situation clarifies before committing to serious negotiations, while others are downgrading the UK from a priority partner to a secondary concern. This represents a strategic setback for Britain's post-Brexit trade ambitions and validates the warnings from Brexit sceptics that leaving the EU would diminish Britain's international influence and negotiating power. Public services are not immune from the chaos either, as government departments struggle to function amid the political firestorm engulfing Westminster. Civil servants who were working on EU alignment projects are being reassigned or placed on administrative leave while investigations determine who knew what and when. Entire policy initiatives are being put on hold or abandoned as ministers frantically try to distance themselves from anything connected to the secret Brussels negotiations. This administrative paralysis is affecting everything from healthcare planning to infrastructure projects to education reform. Programmes that require long-term planning and consistent policy direction are being thrown into disarray as the government lurches from crisis to crisis. The morale within the civil service has plummeted as career officials find themselves caught between political masters who demanded absolute loyalty and secrecy and a public that now views them with suspicion and anger. Whistleblowers who came forward to expose the secret EU alignment programme are being hailed as heroes by some and traitors by others, creating a toxic atmosphere within government departments where trust has completely broken down. Senior civil servants are reportedly considering resignation en masse, warning that the politicisation of the bureaucracy and the pressure to participate in constitutionally questionable activities has made their positions untenable.